Okay, I'm live. That's good. Uh, it is Tuesday evening at about 6:16. I'm getting to a little late today, but I've got lots planned. The first thing I want to mention is hopefully you read the email that was sent out yesterday and talking about our discussion today of lecture 8 and 9 on the spinal cord and on the blood supply to the brain. I also, during this presentation, I have 10 questions that are going to refer to lectures 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, and approximately 2 questions per presentation. So all of you covered that and you've studied that in your notes, so it won't be difficult. It will just be fill in the blank. And you'll have 24 hours to turn it in and submit it by 6:15 tomorrow night. And you'll meet the deadline, can't be any later than 6:15. And I will grade them and let you know what the answers are on the next presentation. And that will give us some more grades and keep you on track and looking at the material and keeping up with it. Now, I want to read this to you, so listen carefully. When you send your email back to me, giving me your answers to the questions, state your name first. So if it's Ashley Woods, put Ashley Woods. If it's Willie Dotson, put Willie Dotson. Then list your 10 answers by simply numbering each answer. Before you list those 10 answers, I want you to type in quiz 1. So you put in your name, quiz 1, and then number 1, your answer, number them 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10. Okay, and I will try and give you a quiz from here on out once or twice a week. We've really got just 3 weeks left, so we still have a lot of material to cover. Your final exam in AP1, I believe now will just cover neuro and integumentary. This will cover 18 lectures in neurology and dermatology or integumentary, which is the skin. I decided to do that rather than have a comprehensive because we're covering so much material on these blogs or YouTubes that I want you to concentrate on the material and learn it well rather than going all the way back to the beginning. All of you have been tested on cyto, histo, skeleton, and muscles. So this way you only concentrate on these last two systems, and I want you to know them well. Neuro is extremely important, and you have to have a good foundation in neuro to progress. The final exam will be given, so mark this on your dates. This is when I've been told I have to give it, May 7th at 9:30 in the morning. And this is the time that's been determined by Southwest for our class to give the exam. All the professors are given specific times, and so I will be here May 7th, 9:30 in the morning, and I'll give you your exam, and I'll talk to you about that just a little bit later. All right. Now, without further ado, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to start out with. Number 1, in the circulation of the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain and around the spinal cord, and through the central canal of the spinal cord, I would like you to tell me what canal or foramen connects the first and second lateral ventricles to the third. What is the canal in the brain that and it allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow from the first and second lateral ventricles to the third. That is question 1. Now, question 2, and if you're not sure of these, just jot down the question and you can go back to it later. But some of you may know them right off because you've been studying. Number 2, what part of the pia mater, or the membrane that lines the ventricles and is over the nervous tissue on the cerebral cortex and dips down, the pia mater dips down into the sulci and over the gyri. What is that cluster of blood vessels called in the pia mater that contain the ependymal cells in the cluster of blood vessels that secrete into the first and second lateral ventricles and the third and fourth ventricles, the cerebral spinal fluid? What I'm asking for is the name of that cluster of blood vessels that extracts from the plasma of the blood the cerebral spinal fluid and secretes it into the first and second lateral ventricles. This cluster of blood vessels exists also in the third, and you find it also in the fourth, and it actually extracts from the plasma the cerebral spinal fluid and releases it into these ventricles. That is number 2. And we will go along, and I'll teach a little bit about the spinal cord now, and then I'll ask you 3 and 4. All right, I want you to open up your class notes to lecture 8 in the nervous system, the spinal cord, and that is on page 20. Now, I hope many of you can see this. We're still working on the central nervous system. Remember, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system comprises all of those structures that are in the nervous system outside the brain and cord. That is the peripheral. So we're still working on the central nervous system. The last couple of weeks, we've been working on structure and function of the brain, which is the largest part of the nervous system. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. It comes off the base of the brain through the hole in the base of the skull, which is the foramen magnum. The spinal cord comes through that foramen magnum. And if you remember, we talked about if you're going up, ascending through the spinal cord, and you pass through the foramen magnum, the very first little enlargement of tissue, once you pass through that foramen magnum, that enlargement was the medulla oblongata. So below that foramen magnum is the spinal cord. And it's as if Mother Nature has grabbed part of the tissue or some of the tissue of the brain and pulled it all the way down through the intervertebral foramen, that hole that is in each vertebra that accommodates the descending spinal cord. And as you remember correctly, those vertebrae changed sizes from top to bottom. The heaviest vertebrae were in the lumbar area, and the lumbar area is usually enlarged quite a bit in the spinal cord because all of the nerves that come off that lumbar area to take care of both legs. You also have an enlargement in the cervical region, and that is where the top of the cervical region and into the seventh portion of the cervical region, you have a cervical plexus, which takes care of the innervation of the arms. But this spinal cord passes through that vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is that bony enclosure that protects the spinal cord. Remember, we discussed the fact that the spinal cord is very delicate, as well as the brain. So that's the reason we had to have that sturdy skull that protects the brain and the vertebra that protect the spinal cord. Now, just as the brain is protected by cerebral spinal fluid, and we have approximately 6, maybe 7 ounces at the most of cerebral spinal fluid, which is around the brain and in the ventricles of the brain, flows all the way around the spinal cord. That's why we call it cerebrospinal fluid. And it also flows through the central canal, a hole that is right here through the center of that spinal cord, the central canal. What's interesting, in a newborn, the hole in the spinal cord is much, much larger. And as the baby grows into adulthood, that central canal narrows quite a bit and is somewhat smaller in an adult than it is in a newborn. All right, if you look at your notes, where it discusses the anatomy of the spinal cord, it defines the cord as a slender white nerve column. Now, you see the word white. Immediately when you see that word, that description of the nerve, that adjective, refers to the outside of the cord, which is white. And it's white because it's heavily myelinated. That means there are thousands of axons that have a myelin sheath or neuroglia wrapped around them. So that's why the outside of the spinal cord is white. Now, the inside of the spinal cord is gray. It's a butterfly-shaped structure from the top to the bottom, and it changes its structure a little bit, but it keeps that butterfly look. And the inside of the spinal cord is gray. The outside is white. Now, the inside of the cord is gray because you're looking at thousands of cell bodies and dendrites, which are unmyelinated. And as you know, unmyelinated nervous tissue is gray in color, whereas the myelinated nervous tissue is white. It's heavy with that myelin sheath, which is a lipoprotein. It's a fatty protein, so protective of those axons. So this is a little bit of a change because the outside of the brain, if you recall, the outside of the brain are millions of cell bodies and dendrites, which are non-myelinated. They're non-myelinated, so the outside of the brain is gray, and the inside of the brain, if you recall, is white. Just the opposite. The outside of the spinal cord is white. The inside of the spinal cord is gray. And you're going to learn a little later in the presentation that the reason the outside of the spinal cord is gray because you have tracks. And we call these tracks in the CNS. In the peripheral nervous system, we call bundles of axons nerves, but in the central nervous system, they're referred to as tracks. And all of these tracks that are outside the gray portion of the spinal cord are heavily, heavily myelinated. So that's why the outside of your spinal cord is white, because of these heavily myelinated tracks. And those tracks either ascend to the brain, carrying messages from the body to the brain, or those tracks, the white portion, descends from the brain, taking messages to muscles and glands. Okay. When you look at the spinal cord, and you can see this definitely in your notes, and I'll email you after this so I can refer you to specific pages in your textbook and the diagrams like I've been doing. But I do want to mention to you that the spinal cord in a newborn baby goes all the way down through the vertebra and terminates in a newborn about the fourth lumbar vertebra. The fourth lumbar vertebra. But as the baby grows into a toddler, an early childhood, adolescence, and eventually into adulthood, the vertebra outgrow and outlengthen the spinal cord. So in the adult, the spinal cord actually terminates between the first and second lumbar vertebra. Below that terminal end of the spinal cord, you have a number of loose spinal tracts we call nerves in the peripheral nervous system, which hang down. And I do have it illustrated here a little bit, so you can see it in this diagram. Here's the base of the brain. Here is the spinal cord. And this artist has illustrated this. I hope you can see it, but you can see it in your textbook and the diagrams I'm going to list. It terminates right here between the first and second lumbar vertebra, and then hanging down from that, you have a number of long fibers. These fibers are tracts, and all of this is encased in the meninges. Now, these tracts hang all the way down into the sacral region, and they refer to these tracts as the cauda equina. I believe I mentioned that to you once before. Cauda means the tail region. Equina means horse, because when they first dissected human beings and studied the spinal cord, the fibers that hang down below the terminal end of the cord look like a horse's tail. Consequently, they called it the cauda equina. And also, because of that, when an anesthesiologist or nurse anesthetist gives a patient an epidural during childbirth to ease the pain, they will give that epidural lower than that terminal end of the spinal cord. They will go almost to below number 2, and they'll inject the anesthetic there, and that anesthetic then surrounds that tissue so that the mother doesn't feel the pain of childbirth, because the epidural has numbed or anesthetized or deadened those nerves temporarily. And once he gives that injection below that second lumbar vertebra, once he gives the injection, he's not injuring anything, because he gives the injection, and these fiber tracts that we call the cauda equina, they just kind of move or blow out of the way. He has to give it that low, because if he gives it higher than L2, L1, L2, he could possibly hit the spinal cord and do severe damage. And he doesn't want to do that. So that's the reason they give the epidural below L1, L2. Okay. Now, the cord, as you know, tapers to a point, and the entire cord consists of 31 segments, and each segment gives rise to a pair of spinal nerves. And altogether, there's 31 segments, so 31 pairs, 62 spinal nerves altogether, from the base of the brain to that second lumbar region. Now, the internal cord, I'm going to show you before I go do that, I want to talk to you about the protection of the cord. Now, the cord requires just as much protection. Oh, this is the diagram I wanted to show you, showing that does a little bit better example of the cauda equina. So you can see all of those structures hanging below L2. That's the cauda equina, and that was what I was looking for. All right. Your spinal cord is as delicate as the brain, and it requires protection. So you know already from studying the skeletal system that the vertebrae encase and protect the descending cord. You also know that when we studied the brain, that the cranial vault protected the brain, and that within the brain there is a certain amount of cerebral spinal fluid that the brain floats in, and that cerebral spinal fluid protects the brain from impact. It keeps it buoyant and protected. And thirdly, we mentioned that the brain is protected by meninges, meninges. If you're talking about these membranes and you're talking about one membrane, it's a meninx, meninx. But if you're talking about all three or two of them, they're referred to as the meninges. Now, the meninges protects the spinal cord as well as the brain. And here's a little bit of a review. Here is the skin of the scalp. This is the periosteum, which is on the outside of bone, outside of your skull. Remember the periosteum that was around the outside of your long bones, periosteum. So there's the periosteum. Here is the cranial vault. There's the cranium. Below that is the first, if you remember correctly, the very first meninges, which was the dura mater. And the dura mater, we mentioned, is one membrane but two layers. And the layer just underneath the cranium is the periosteal dura mater. That's the periosteal. And below the periosteal dura mater, remember it's one membrane, two layers, is the meningeal dura mater. And they call it the meningeal dura mater because it's lying right next, and it's purple in this illustration, right next to the arachnoid layer. So here is the periosteal and meningeal dura mater. Here is the arachnoid mater, and it's a thin membrane underneath the dura mater that has the fibers that hang down and attach to the pia mater. If you remember correctly, the spinal fluid flows in that subarachnoid space. The fluid flows in that subarachnoid space. So here's the arachnoid membrane. Here are the fibers. So the fluid is below the arachnoid layer and in that space. This is important because that cerebral spinal fluid then comes into direct contact with the third membrane, which hugs the gyri and the sulci, which we refer to as the pia mater, and it's full of the blood vessels that are protected by the blood-brain barrier that actually feeds the brain. I also want to mention to you again that just like the choroid plexus makes the cerebral spinal fluid, it extracts it from the plasma of the blood. The little villi right here that are part of the arachnoid layer, these little finger-like projections merge into the split between the periosteal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater right here. And the blood vessels in those arachnoid villi they're full of little blood vessels. They're absorbing the cerebral spinal fluid that is being used, or old cerebral spinal fluid, and then at the same time, the choroid plexus of the pia mater in the right and left lateral ventricles in the third and the fourth is making it and sending it into those ventricles. So here you definitely see the meninges that are highly protective of the brain. Well, we need to protect the spinal cord as well. And here's an artist's rendition. I don't know what I would do without diagrams because they say a thousand words. A picture says 1,000 words. Here is the spinal column. If you remember from the skeletal system in AP1, this is the centrum. This would be the anterior portion of the cord. This is what the vertebra look like when an individual is facing forward, or if they're on their back, ventral side up, belly side up. Here is the centrum. Behind the centrum, of course, is the vertebral foramen. Here is the spinal cord. Here is the transverse process, and it's not showing you the spinous process, which is in the back. But here's the cord, and this artist has carefully illustrated for you the white external cord, which is heavily myelinated, and the butterfly-shaped internal gray cord here. And also with that, you see the very distinct layers of the meninges, starting on the outside with the dura mater, which is tough and durable. Underneath the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, right here. And then underneath the arachnoid, clinging to the surface of the spinal cord, is the soft mother, the pia mater, right here. And then in between that pia mater and the arachnoid mater, in the subarachnoid space, you find your cerebral spinal fluid. And it's also flowing through this little hole in the center of the cord, which we call the central canal. Okay, and that's good. That shows you. It also is good in showing you how the roots, the spinal nerves, come off, as you can see here and here, off of that cord, and we'll talk about those later also. Okay, and let me give you another picture of a cross section through the spinal cord. I'll show you the artist's rendition first, and then I'll show you what it really looks like if you did a photograph of the spinal cord. But I love this one. Okay, here again is a transverse section through the spinal cord. Here is the centrum, the drum-like portion of the vertebra. And when you look at that, the artist has carefully drawn the outer solid bone, which we consider dense bone or hard bone, and then in the center, the spongy bone. Remember, the spongy bone throughout your entire body is working very hard in what we call the hematopoietic process, the process in making red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. So there's the spongy bone. We also call it the myeloid tissue, red bone marrow, or cancellous tissue. So there's the centrum, and he's even illustrated the spinous process. This would be on the back side of the spinal cord, the spinous process, and on either side is the transverse process. A process, again, is any place where bone is built up, and the processes occur so that tendons can attach muscles to that bone. Now, he's also illustrated in this hard, compact bone in the spinous process and in the transverse process with the spongy bone in the center, which is also at work carrying on hematopoiesis, making that blood. Now, he's cut the cross section. What I want you to see here is that all around the outside of this cord, in what they call the epidural space, this is the dura mater right there, the white dura mater around the cord. Epidural space is that space above and on the outside of the epidural layer. It's the epidural space, but it's the dura mater. That's why they call it the epidural space. And it is filled with fat. Now you may wonder, what does fat do? Fat's a great insulator. It's a great supporter, and it's protective. So not only do you have the bony cylinder here and the cerebral spinal fluid that is flowing around the cord to cushion the cord, but you also have this layer of fat, adipose tissue. Remember, adipose tissue is one of the connective tissues, and it has a very important responsibility surrounding your spinal cord. Now, here's the transverse section. Everything you look at in white is heavily myelinated. And in this heavily myelinated area of the cord, there are sections of that white myelinated tissue that carry the messages up the brain, up to the brain. So there are ascending tracts. And remember, a tract is a nerve. We just call it a tract when it's in the CNS. And you have other areas that have descending tracts carrying messages from the brain down. So you may want to make a decision to pick up a pen with your precentral gyrus, where you control gross and fine motor movements. So the precentral gyrus in front of the central sulcus makes the decision to manipulate the environment. That comes down through the basal nuclei, then through the thalamus, which directs it down through the brainstem, comes through the midbrain, pons, medulla, and then down the cord by descending tracts in the myelinated tissue. And those descending tracts then will move into the ventral horns of the gray matter and out the motor nerve. It's a nerve because it's leaving the spinal cord. So it's outside the spinal cord, so it is a nerve. And it's going to exit the ventral portion of the cord and go to muscles or glands. So the tracts either ascend or descend. You don't ascend on the same track that you descend. Some of these areas only carry information in an ascension or carry information down in a descension. It's like a divided highway. Now, if you look at the butterfly-shaped area in the center, the gray area, remember when you see gray nervous tissue, it's just millions of cell bodies and dendrites that are non-myelinated. And if you look at this structure, it looks like a butterfly, but that butterfly changes its shape from the cervical region all the way down. And these upper areas of this butterfly are referred to as the dorsal horns, and the larger areas down in here are referred to as the ventral horns. Dorsal horns and ventral horns. And there in the center is the central canal through which the spinal fluid flows. Now, you can definitely see in this illustration, you can see the dura mater and then the arachnoid layer with the fibers hanging down attached to the pia mater, which clings tightly to the white portion of the spinal cord, clings tightly. Now, I want you to notice that on the dorsal side, and you know it's the dorsal side of the cord because here is the spinous process. This is the ventral side because this is the centrum or the drum of the vertebra. And if you look on the dorsal side, you'll see a median, and it's called a median because it's in the middle of a median sulcus, and which is a shallow groove or crevice. And that's important because there are blood vessels that ascend and descend that actually feed the cord itself. And on the ventral side of the cord, you'll see a medial, because it's the midline of the transverse section through the cord, you'll see a medial fissure. And a fissure is a deep, wide valley or groove. We talked about the longitudinal fissure that separates the right and the left hemispheres. We talked about the transverse fissure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then we also talked about the lateral fissure that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal. And this is the medial fissure that you see dramatically illustrated by this artist in the transverse section of the cord. Now, another thing I want you to notice is that this being the dorsal side of the cord, let me take my glasses off, this being the dorsal side of the cord here is the area where sensory innervation enters. Anything you feel on the surface of your body, which is detected by your skin, that your skin is the largest organ in the body, and it's full of all sorts of afferent sensory neurons for touch, pressure, pain, heat. All of these feelings are relayed to the spinal cord by afferent sensory neurons bundling together to become afferent sensory nerves, and they will enter the back side of the spinal cord. And you can identify that because here is what they call the dorsal root, kind of like a tree root. It is entering the spinal cord on both sides. That is the dorsal root. And connected to that dorsal root is this enlargement right here, which is called the dorsal root ganglion. So you can tell the dorsal side of the spinal cord by the dorsal root ganglion, which is closer to the back side of the cord, and by this dorsal root. So everything you feel that is detected by sensory afferent neurons in your body are sent back to the cord and enters the dorsal side of the cord. Now, the ventral side of the cord has, coming off the ventral horn, this ventral side has a ventral root. It does not have a ganglion here associated with it, but this ventral root is a motor root or a motor nerve. So the sensory nerve goes in the back door of the spinal cord. The motor nerve comes out the ventral side of the spinal cord. Now, what's interesting is this nerve is a sensory nerve. This nerve is a motor nerve. But here, when the motor and the sensory come together, they come together in this area and they're bundled together by connective tissue. And where they lie side by side, they're referred to as a mixed nerve. So if you have a sensory nerve entering the dorsal side of the cord and it's in juxtaposition to a ventral nerve, which is on the ventral side of the cord here, they're in juxtaposition. It's called a mixed nerve. Once they get to the cord, they're segregated. And this is a sensory nerve, and this is a motor nerve. Where they unite, they're mixed. Okay. Now that's a little bit of a discussion. I do want to mention something else. I mentioned the dorsal root ganglion. They're showing it right here with the connective tissue around it. And on this side, the connective tissue, the artist has cut that connective tissue away, and you can see the nerve itself. And there is the dorsal root ganglion. There's the dorsal root ganglion. And a ganglion is any place in the peripheral nervous system where there is a bunch of cell bodies clumped together. That is a ganglion. Now, once a bunch of cell bodies exists in the brain or spinal cord, it is a nuclei. Remember the basal nuclei in the brain and the basal nuclei and the relationship between the basal nuclei and dopamine and acetylcholine. Those basal nuclei, which are some of the gray areas in the white part of the brain, just represent clumps of cell bodies and dendrites. That's what that means. So they're in the CNS, so they're referred to as a nuclei. In the PNS, they're called a ganglion. Now, the dorsal root is involved right here. The dorsal root and the dorsal horns are involved with sensory activity. This is where sensation is experienced. And the ventral is motor. So you feel with the dorsal horns, and the ventral horns send the motor nerve out to do something about it. Now notice the ventral horns are fatter. That's because these fat ventral horns are just large numbers of cell bodies and dendrites clumped together in a nuclei right here, whereas the same structure out here is cell bodies and dendrites, which are sensory. It's a sensory dorsal root ganglion, and this is a motor nuclei. We don't call it ganglion, we call it a cluster of cell bodies known as a nuclei in the ventral horns. Okay. I did want to point that out. Now, I want to mention to you, before I do that, I want to show you this. Oh, not that. Well, here it is after all. Okay, just like class. Okay. Now, when you look at tissue, just a minute. When you look at tissue in a cadaver, the real thing looks quite a bit different than the artist's rendition. Here is a transverse section of, or a micrograph of the spinal cord, and this is the real tissue. Transverse section, you can see the H-shaped butterfly structure here. Everything on the outside, it looks kind of blonde or tan. That is white myelinated tissue. Remember, they have the spinal tracts that ascend and descend, and the cross section shows you the gray area in the center. This area here would be the dorsal. These are dorsal horns. Remember, they're involved in sensory. And here is the ventral horns. They're involved with motor. Now, we defined the three types of neurons. Oh, in the first couple of days of class, when I still had you face to face. And in that discussion, we talked about sensory neurons, motor neurons. Sensory are going to the brain and spinal cord with messages, motor are coming away from the brain and spinal cord, and the associative neurons, which we also called interneurons or connective neurons, linked the sensory to the motor. So these would be sensory. This is sensory tissue, cell bodies, and dendrites. Right here in the center would be associative neurons, which are going to link the sensory to the motor, and the motor would come out here. Now, this shows you, and pretty dramatically, the dorsal root ganglion right here. And they've cut it off so you actually don't see where the ventral root and the dorsal root merge here to be to be pronounced as a mixed nerve. But you see the dorsal root ganglion on the outside, and that illustrates or shows you to the dorsal side of the cord, and there would be the dorsal root. Here's the dorsal root ganglion, and this is the dorsal root. This would be the ventral root, which would also come out, except the ventral root would be carrying a message to the muscles and glands, muscles to contract and glands to secrete. But that's what it looks like in a real cadaver's transverse micrograph section of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, I want to mention something to you here, and this will tell you a little bit about what we call a reflex arc. And I'll talk about the reflex arc, and I'm trying to, I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail later, but I do want to mention this to you. And I think this shows it the best. If you're talking about a toddler may toddle up in the kitchen, and mother is cooking or baking a cake or biscuits in the oven, and the outside of the oven is hot. If the toddler touches the outside of the oven, then that toddler is going to pull his or her hand away from the oven very quickly. Okay. And the reason for that is in that toddler's skin are millions of sensory afferent neurons for touch, temperature, and pain. So if the toddler touches the stove and it's hot, then they pull their hand away from the stove. Once they pull their hand away from the stove, then they realize what happened, and wham, they're yelling because they may have burned their hand. But the toddler has an autonomic reflex that moves the hand away from the stove before the message gets to the brain that the toddler has injured and he feels the pain. So this autonomic reflex occurs in what we call the reflex arc. So afferent sensory neurons will carry the message of pain and temperature, which was instigated because of the burning of the skin. And afferent sensory neurons will go to the cord, and these neurons will pass up the cord, not the cord, I'm talking about the spinal nerves into the dorsal root ganglion, and it will go in the back door of the spinal cord to the dorsal horn, and then the associative neuron will link the the sensory neuron to the motor. The motor will come out the ventral horn and merge by the ventral root. It will pass down through the mixed nerve and will go to the muscles of the arm and hand to pull that hand away from that which was injuring it. That is referred to as a reflex arc. In other words, the response occurred autonomically at the spinal cord level. It occurred autonomically at the spinal cord level without any forethought. It was automatic, autonomic. And then after the baby pulled his hand away because of that reflex arc, the message was relayed through the white portion of the cord, ascending up the cord to the postcentral gyrus, where in the parietal lobe of the brain, where that sensation of pain was registered. And the baby's response to it occurred after the reflex had moved the hand away. That's called a reflex arc, a reflex arc. And a reflex is, and you can write this down in your notes. If we were in class, I would have you write it down. A reflex is an unpremeditated, P-R-E-M-E-D-I-T-A-T-E-D, an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. A reflex is an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. In this case, the stimulus was the hot stove and the damage to the skin. And it's an unpremeditated response because the baby didn't have to think about it. You don't have to say, well, my hand is burning. Maybe it's a good idea to pull it away from the stove. It did it autonomically in what we call an unpremeditated response or reflex. You see the same thing happen when you go to the doctor's office and you sit on the edge of the examining table and he touches the patellar tendon with the little mallet and you get a response. You don't have to think about it. You just give that response. Now, with that in mind, I almost got carried away and didn't give you your next two questions. Let me do that. Question number 3. Give me the name of a structure in the peripheral nervous system, all of you should get this, which refers to a clump of cell bodies and dendrites. Give me the name of a clump of cell bodies and dendrites in the peripheral nervous system. Now, from our discussion today, you should know that one. That was number 3. Number 4 is give me that part of the brain stem that the spinal cord, as it ascends and enters the foramen magnum, as it comes through the foramen magnum, that portion of the spinal cord, as it comes through, bulges forward just a little bit. And in that area where that tissue bulges forward, that part of the brainstem is responsible for respirations, the heartbeat, cardiac heartbeat, and blood pressure. That tissue also has nerves that run on the outside or decussate on the outside of this structure. And that's important because when you make a decision with the right part of the brain, it crosses over at this portion of the brain stem and affects and lets you control the left side of the body. whereas the right brain will send the message through the basal nuclei, down through the thalamus, through the brainstem, all the way down, and it crosses over on the anterior portion of this structure so that the left brain controls the right side of the body. What is this structure called? And has 3 activities. I think I mentioned to you that Christopher Reeves probably had damage done to this portion of the brainstem when he took that horrible fall off the horse. So that is number 4. And I think I'll go ahead and give you number 5 too. Tell me what that protective mechanism is. And in the brain, in which astrocytes wrap around blood vessels and make sure that blood within these blood vessels in the brain doesn't release certain hormones and certain amino acids and other substances that can actually damage the brain. Not only do these astrocytes help protect that brain from anything deleterious that can be released by these blood vessels. The blood vessels themselves, the capillary wall, have very tight junctions, just like that, very, very tight junctions, so that some of these substances can't get out or get in. What is this part of the brain called? So that was number 5. That was number 5. Okay. Now, if you look where it discusses the physiology of the spinal cord, we mentioned 3, or we're mentioning 3 different physiologies that the spinal cord does, 3 different functions, 3 different tasks. And number 1 was reflex activity. That means the transfer and integration. That transfer means sensory neurons going afferently towards the cord with information about the environment. That's the transfer. Integration of messages means that sensory is taking the message to the associative neuron inside the cord, and that associative neuron links it to the motor. That's the integration of the message, sensory to motor, with central or interneuron in between. That's motor is the link of sensory, associative, motor. So that's the reflex. And that was the unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. Same thing happens if you're driving down a street and you're going slowly. It's in a residential section and you're only going maybe 20 miles an hour, and you don't see it until the last second, and a child runs out into the street chasing a ball. And you throw on your brakes, and once you throw on the brake and you miss the child, thank goodness, the child picks up the ball and looks at you and runs back, then you realize what just happened. So those were your reflexes making that decision. And that was the reflex arc. You made an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. Then after you threw your foot on that brake and stopped, saved the child's life, then you realized what happened, because the ascending tracts in the white portion of the spinal cord has carried the message up through the brainstem, through the thalamus, and then to the at this portion to the frontal lobe of the brain, so you have cognition of what just happened. So that's number 1. That's a reflex activity. Number 2 is the conduction of sensory impulses or afferent tracts to the brain. Remember, we mentioned that there are certain tracts in the white portion of the spinal cord that ascend, carrying the message of what is happening in the environment to the brain so that you have cognition. That would be the conduction of sensory impulses afferent tracts to the brain. And number 3, the conduction of motor impulses. These are efferent from the brain down the descending tracts to the nerves for muscles and glands. And this was our discussion of ascending and descending tracts. Please look those up. Then locate these tracts on the transverse section of your cord. So these are the 3 physiologies. Number 1, that reflex arc, so that you respond to the environment and save your life. All of us have had ancestors going back millions of years whose lives were saved by their reflexes. And your reflexes are at its best in the late teens. The only problem is the reflexes are great in the late teens, but their judgment as far as depth perception and how fast something will occur, say a speeding vehicle, that takes more maturity to develop that better depth perception. But their reflexes are very, very good. The only problem is their depth perception isn't as good. But that's the reflex, the conduction of sensory, and then making the decision coming down the descending tracts and out the ventral portion of the cord to the muscles and glands. Now, next is the physiology of a reflex arc. And in doing that, I want you to look at the drawing or look on your notes on page 20. The spinal reflex pathway has 5 separate structures that we've mentioned. The first one is the receptor. Well, in this case, the receptor is the receptor organ that picks up on the change in the environment by those afferent sensory neurons. So you could be walking along a beach and you step on a piece of glass, and the pain neurons in your foot, if you're barefooted, send the message up to the spinal cord, and then enters the dorsal side of the spinal cord, comes out the ventral side of the spinal cord to those muscles and glands, and you pull your foot away. That skin picking up on the pain is the receptor. The nerves that carried the message, those sensory nerves that carried the message to the spinal cord, those are afferent neurons within those afferent sensory nerves. Once it gets to the dorsal root of the spinal cord, it connects to the ventral root of the spinal cord by the connective neuron. We also called it the associative neuron or the interneuron. Then the message comes out the ventral portion of the spinal cord to the efferent neurons in those efferent nerves, and to the muscle or gland, which is the effector. Those are the 5 separate structures involved in that reflex arc. So please study that. Okay. Now that takes us to, all right, number 6. Your 6th question. I'll do 6 and 7. Okay. In 6, give me that part of the brain that is hollow. It's a hollow structure. And inside that hollow structure is the 3rd ventricle. This hollow structure is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And hanging from the roof of this hollow structure is the pineal gland. The outside of this hollow structure is white. It's myelinated. And it's part of the diencephalon. It also acts as a relay center, sending everything that you see, hear, taste, and touch to the right part of the brain. So I'm feeling the chair, and the right arm of the chair is wooden, solid, and cool. My afferent sensory neurons are carrying it to the spinal cord. It enters the spinal cord, goes up the ascending tracks. It comes up through the medulla oblongata, through the pons, and the midbrain into this portion of the diencephalon, which sends it where? To the postcentral gyrus, so that I have awareness or cognition of what this feels like. What is this egg-shaped hollow structure containing cerebral spinal fluid with the pineal gland hanging from its roof, which acts as a relay center? And keep in mind, too, that this hollow structure also, now I lost my train of thought. Third ventricle, hollow structure, relay center, I think is part of the diencephalon. Maybe that was it, is part of the diencephalon. Okay, that would be number 6. Now, for number 7, of the 3 meninges, give me the name of the meninges that closely adheres to the gyri of the brain, sinks down into the sulci. This meninges also adheres tightly to the outside of the spinal cord. And this meninges is full of blood vessels, and these blood vessels feed the brain and feed the cord. It's the innermost meninges. It's the innermost meninges. So give me that name. And then for number 8, I want you to give me the name of the large hole in the base of the brain through which the spinal cord enters the brain or exits the brain. What is this large foramen on the base of the brain through which the spinal cord enters and exits? That is number 8. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about the blood supply to the brain. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into the intensity in this blood supply to the brain as it's presented on page 22. But I do want you to know what I am teaching. When you get into AP2 and you study the cardiovascular system, then you'll study this again in a great deal more detail. But I want you to understand this first, and only this today. Okay. Okay. Now, one of the things you're going to learn as medical health practitioners is how to pick up on a pulse if you touch the side of the throat. As a matter of fact, sometimes when people are trying to determine whether someone is alive or dead, they may gently put their fingers on the side of the neck to feel the blood coursing up from the aortic arch to the brain. They're feeling the carotid artery. So you have on the right side of the neck a right carotid artery, on the left a left carotid artery. And the carotids feed the outside of the brain and about 1 inch to 1.5 inches just within the brain. All right. Now I'm going to show you the outside of the heart right here. And before I talk about these carotids, I want you to know where the carotid comes from. Here here is a diagram of the heart, and you can see this in the cardiovascular section of your textbook. But coming off the left side of the heart is blood that has just returned from the lungs. And the blood in the left side of the heart, in that left ventricle, is oxygenated, and the blood is highly, it's 93 to 97% saturated with oxygen, and the blood is a bright, bright red, kind of the color of a fire engine. When the left ventricle contracts, it pushes blood up into this, the largest artery of the body, that is the aorta. The Romans and the Greeks thought that the aorta suspended the heart in the chest, and the word aorta means, in Latin or Greek derivated, it means to suspend. And actually the heart is in place by connective tissue. It isn't being suspended by the aorta, but the name sticks. And the aorta is the largest artery in the body. Notice it ascends and then makes this aortic arch. Now, that oxygenated blood coming from the left side of the heart, it's going to feed oxygenated blood to the heart itself. The heart doesn't get oxygen from the oxygenated hemoglobin inside the chambers because the blood is moving too rapidly. The heart gets its own oxygen so it can carry on aerobic glycolysis. It gets its own oxygen from the right and left coronary. So as the aorta ascends, you see here the right and the left coronary artery, which breaks down to arterioles and then capillaries and takes care of the heart's needs. So the heart takes care of oxygenation to itself first. The heart takes care of itself. Because remember, this is a cardiac muscle that says never stop. And only in death is the only thing that's going to stop this little heart from pumping. And on the average of about 72 times 72 beats a minute. Now, at the top of the aortic arch, you're going to see 3 arteries, 1, 2, 3. And the artist here has cut them off so that you can see them. Now, in this artery right there, and you remember an artery, like the aorta, it's a large blood vessel. It's not quite the size of the aorta, but it is a large blood vessel. And this artery right here is referred to as the brachiocephalic. The word cephalic means some of the blood in this artery is going to go to the right side of the brain. And then some of the blood, that's cephalic, and some of the blood is going into the right arm, the brachial, right arm, brachial, or subclavian. And it's fused here. Now, this blood vessel is going to, it's called the left common carotid, and it's going to the left brain. And this blood vessel is going to the left arm, left subclavian. Sometime through our history, these two, this blood vessel fused. It may have been 2, and it fused sometime in our evolutionary history, or these 2 were fused and split. But what you're going to see is this brachiocephalic will go up so far, and then it'll bifurcate. Bifurcate means it will split in 2. It will come down into the right subclavian and feed the right arm, and then the right carotid and come and feed the right part of the brain. This one feeds the left carotid, and this feeds the left arm. So the heart receives its blood supply first from the right and left coronaries, and then the heart takes care of the brain and the arms, their oxygenation needs secondarily. Now, it's important Actually, it's more important that it goes to the brain than even to the arms, because if the brain goes for more than 4 minutes without oxygen, those neurons can start to die. So it is important. But I wanted to show you that. And let me see. Here is another view of it. And I would pass all these out. This is kind of darker, but I'm hoping you can see it. It's a little dramatic here. Okay, here's the aortic arch. There is the right brachiocephalic. There's the trunk, right brachiocephalic artery. And remember, I told you it separates right here or bifurcates. And you can see these diagrams in the cardiovascular section of your textbook. So it bifurcates or separates. This goes to the right arm by the right subclavian, and this becomes the right carotid. This is the left. This feeds the left side of the brain. That's the left carotid, and that's the left subclavian going to the left arm. Now, so this would be the right carotid to feed the outside of the brain on the right side, and this is the left carotid to feed the left side of the brain, of course, on the left side. Now, the carotid itself bifurcates here and here, and you can see that little bit of a bifurcation at the top. It's been cut off, but it's bifurcating so that the very outside of the right carotid feeds the outside of the brain, and the next bifurcation of that carotid will feed the brain about an inch and a half on the inside, and the same thing with the left carotid. So the carotids are the main arteries that feed oxygenated blood to the outside of the brain and about an inch and a half into the brain. Now, these carotids break down from large arteries to smaller arteries and smaller arteries, arterioles, and capillaries. And as you know, at the capillary level, that's where the exchange in oxygen and carbon dioxide and glucose and amino acids, that's where it occurs. But keep in mind that astrocytes will wrap themselves, these were the neuroglia we talked about the other day, the astrocytes will wrap themselves around these capillaries, and then the capillaries have tight junctions which protect the brain. That was what we called the blood-brain barrier, okay? And these capillaries afford that. Now, that's what I meant by the blood supply to the brain. Now, you also have a blood supply to the middle of the brain. We've talked about the right external carotid taking care of the outside of the brain, and the right and left internal carotid caring for the brain an inch to an inch and a half. Now, something else occurs, and that means coming off of the subclavians is another blood vessel, another artery, which comes off the right and left subclavians, but this artery comes up the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra. And let me show you that. Okay. I want you to see this too. Okay. If you'll bear with me, I'll get everything. I love to be in class because I can spread all my transparencies out everywhere and find them much more easily than this. Okay. Now, if you look here, before I show you this, do you remember when we were studying the cervical vertebra? And we said the intervertebral foramen runs through all the vertebrae, and that's where the spinal cord exists and is protected by that bony cylinder. But up in the cervical vertebra, you not only have the intervertebral foramen, but you also have on each side transverse foramen. So you have 3 little holes in the cervical vertebra. And in those little lateral holes, what we call the transverse foramina, that is where vertebral arteries coming from the right and left subclavian, and they call them vertebral arteries because they come up through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra, vertebral. So you can see, I don't have one for the left, so you can imagine, but here it is. Off your right and left subclavian, you have another blood vessel, another artery that comes off the subclavian and goes up the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra and enters the base of the brain and comes up through the middle portion of the brain. And these vertebral arteries on the right and on the left feed the center of the brain, just like the external and internal carotids feed the outside of the brain. Okay, now let me see. I was going to give you number 9 and 10. Number 9. I want you to give me the part of the brain that is responsible for smooth motor movements and balance, working with the inner ear and also the proprioceptive senses coming up through the muscles, balance, and smooth muscular movements, balance, and muscle tone. Muscle tone. Those are the 3 physiologies of this part of the brain. It is also characteristic because the outside is gray in color and the gyri and sulci are linear. So rather than being convoluted on the cortices of the cerebrum, this part of the brain has gyri and sulci, which are straight and linear. What part of the brain does that? And for number 10, and all of you better answer this one, give me the name of that blood vessel or artery that feeds the outside of your cortices and the inside of the cortices about 1.5 inches within. And this blood vessel breaks down to smaller arteries and arterioles and eventually capillaries. What's the name of that classic blood vessel that feeds the outside of the cortices? Okay, now I want you to remember when you email your answers to me, the deadline will be tomorrow at 6:15 tomorrow on the 15th. And put your name, John Doe, quiz 1, John Doe quiz 1, and then number 1, answer, then number 2, answer, number 3, answer, and give me those answers spelled correctly because you do have your books. So with no further ado, I'll let you go. And hopefully I'll get that in tomorrow from you, and I'll start working on lectures 10 and 11. 10 and 11. Let's see, we've spent, goodness, an hour and 24 minutes, almost an hour and a half, but I enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time. If you have any questions, you know to call me, 761-3636, not after 9 o'clock because I turn into a pumpkin. And that's it. I'll see you next time. And everybody, make 100 on this little quiz assignment. Oh, please. Okay. Goodbye. Have a good evening.